So local elections happened in the municipalities and the counties in Taiwan, and the Democratic Progressive Party, which is Tsai Ing-wen, president or whatever she is, she is the head authority in Taiwan. Tsai Ing-wen, her party, which is a pro-independence, pro-separatist party, just got laid a smackdown in these local elections. Taipei is no longer under DPP control. And I believe, let's see, what are the numbers here? I believe it was something like out of 21 posts for these city mayors, the KMT, which was which is a nationalist party, they won 13 of them. And so now they have something like 70% of the population within their districts. And Tsai Ing-wen had to step down as head of the party. And while she will serve out, I think, another 2 years as the head authority of the island, she will that party is likely in a lot of trouble unless they can stir up something to change their political fortunes. But it's a huge deal because and I find it quite interesting that these protests, especially the ones in Shanghai, which had anti-regime and pro-regime change, like anti-China messages, anti-Xi Jinping, pro-regime change messages in Shanghai, they were happening at the same time that this was happening in Taiwan. I find it very curious, very, very good timing, because no one was talking about this, and it potentially spells doom for the US's policy of waging kind of a Ukraine-like proxy war against China via Taiwan. So, Garland, what are your thoughts about this? Because, of course, we're talking about the one China policy. Where this comes amid Biden and Xi's talk at the G20. There's been a lot of indications, and it's not just Taiwan, it's not just China, that there is like a lot of divides. They talk about NATO unity and unity between the US and Europe. But there's a lot of divisions here. There's a lot of what's the best way to go about it. A lot of European countries are trying to cool it with China because they need the business. If they don't get the business this winter from China, that's like a double whammy of having no energy and no commodities flowing. That sounds like a recipe for complete collapse, let alone an economic crisis. And the United States is also hedging their bets, wondering how aggressive to be with China at this time, given the delicate situation happening with Ukraine. So what are your thoughts about all these developments, and especially in regard to Taiwan?
Well, one of the interesting things about Taiwan, I'm glad I get to report on that a lot, very, very often, like almost daily, pretty much on China. And when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, the United States, the Western media didn't report the protest. They didn't report there was like a bomb threat at her hotel and near her hotel. There were people in the street holding signs. Then when she went to South Korea, the South Korean president was like staying 20 minutes from where she was. He wouldn't come see her. He was afraid. He stayed away from her. His numbers are down. So what I see here is the U.S. Media does a good job of hiding the truth from us often, but that doesn't affect the truth. So they were able to hide from the American people who weren't able to dig down and see that there was protest and unhappiness. And the people in Taiwan were saying, we don't want to be Ukraine 2.0. We can see how that turns out. They may have hid it from us, but the time came for voting, and the people of Taiwan, who are very comfortable with a status quo. Also, and this is something that's not being reported, the people of Taiwan, a lot of people are very angry. Their crown jewel is TSMC. Their crown jewel is this, a chip making plant of all chip making plants. They got it. That's what makes things work for Taiwan. And the U.S., when Tsai Ing-wen working together, it's like moving the most highly technical part, that's like I think 3 nanometers or less chips, to Arizona. So the U.S. is doing the same thing to Taiwan, and that's what they do to their vassals, that they're doing to Europe. They're going in there and saying, man, that's a nice chip making plant you got. Why don't we just take that and move that here? And of course, Tsai Ing-wen's like, sure, whatever you want, doesn't matter. Well, though the people in Taiwan were noticing that, they weren't happy with that. The U.S. Media is not going to report on that. But now it's being clear. It's clear the people have voted and they don't want to go in that direction. And I suspect they're going to continue in that direction. And by the time the 2 years is up, I mean, this, as you said, this plan for Taiwan to be Ukraine 2.0 has just flopped. It has just fallen. The people of Ukraine, I mean, the people of Taiwan have said no, which also means this, that the Chinese government can now look at it and say, we're actually aligned with the people of Taiwan. So Kevin McCarthy, has said monkey see, monkey do. Oh, as soon as I get in power, if he does, the first thing I'm going to do is go to Taiwan, because Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan. Well, now the Chinese people, the Chinese government can simply say, you guys do whatever you want. You can play all the games. You can run back and forth to Taiwan. You can do all of the things that are supposed to offend or upset us. But guess what? We got the Taiwanese people. We're just going to keep our powder dry. In 2 years, there'll be someone in charge, and we will continue to work out this one China thing. Sorry, the jig is up. That ain't working. And I suspect long before then, probably within the next few months, this Ukraine thing's going to fall apart. My prediction for that is collapse. And the two are working together, because as Russia is involved in a kinetic war against the U.S. empire, clearly Russia and China are working together for what the diplomatic end of it, where they're going around the world, they're making friends, they're building BRICS and SCO. You can't separate China and Russia now when you look at what they're doing diplomatically and economically, how they're building coalitions. They are working together very, very broadly throughout the world. And they're using, basically, when it comes, there's a diplomatic war. And the way I would put it is the U.S. is using the iron fist diplomatically around the world, threatening, Africa, whoever, and China and Russia together are using a velvet glove, making friends, giving people wheat, things of that nature. And I think we know how that works. One other thing I'd have to say, one last thing, India, very important. And here's what and here's why India has no choice but to side with Russia and China. India aspires to be a world power. They're already looking at saying, wait a minute. We know that if we start to rise like Russia and China, the U.S. is going to be on our border in Kashmir, whatever the hell. They'll find someplace. They're going to be on our border. They're going to be pumping weapons in. They know the game, that if they start to rise like they would like to, that the U.S. is coming after them next. So they have no choice. Any country that aspires to be a world power or even a regional power has to side with Russia, China, India, because they're looking at the future, and they know if they don't, they got the crosshairs right between their eyes.
Oh, Margaret is. Oh, there you go.
Yeah. Everyone, it's a funny thing about being the bully. The bully can win. You can beat up the other kids on the block, but everybody else notices how that is done. And it goes back to the point I was making earlier about every move the U.S. makes to increase its power hurts it in some other way. So India, as you said, wants to be a world power. All this cajoling, trying to get them not to buy Russian oil, it's just stupid. And that's what I meant about these people. First of all, India, they already screwed themselves when the U.S. told them to stop buying Iranian oil. So they did themselves in once, and then along comes a new nincompoop in the White House saying, don't buy oil from that one. And they're like, actually, no, we're going to buy oil from whoever we want. Thank you very much. So you have this hope that countries are stupid or will do themselves in when they have an interest, a vested interest in siding with this other pole. And there is a multipolar world. You can't change it. You can't end it. And this fantasy that they can break up Russia, or, Putin will be kicked out of power, Xi Jinping is going to be kicked out of power, it's just nonsense. But I think, unfortunately, there are people in Washington who, really believe their own hype, who really think so. But the Indias of the world are telling them that that's not true. But that's the danger that these people pose to us. Even as we can see, it's very clear that countries that have independence, that are not vassals, are moving towards that other pole and away from the United States. So we will see how this is going to turn out, and exactly how the U.S. is undermining itself.
If I
Well,
may, one
yep.
more thing. So the U.S. Recently has started this chip war against China, where they're passing these laws so that that U.S. companies can't sell chips to China, and it is spectacularly backfiring. They've had tens. At last I heard 30 or 35,000 layoffs in Silicon Valley. So the U.S. in these crazy ideologues are doing to their own country what they're doing to Europe. They're like screwing over our technology sector. In all of this is a mad grasp to say, oh no, we're losing unipolar power and hegemony. We've got to hold on to it. It's kind of like the little girl with the rabbit kind of story, where her parents buy her a rabbit, and on the way home in the car, she loves the rabbit and she hugs the rabbit so tight that by the time she got home, she smothered the rabbit. And that's what they're doing. They're trying to hold on to hegemony so tight. They're squeezing it. No, you've got to give me that. You've got to do that. And as Margaret said, they're smothering it out by trying to hold on to it so hard.
I want to, as we train, because I definitely want to close. I know we want to try to keep this at 90 minutes. So I want to just add to that before getting into these protests that a lot of people have been asking to cover here. So I thought it would be good to comment. I do have a couple of threads on Twitter, not long, so we should be able to get through them in about a minute. I'll just quickly read through them. And then the Global Times actually published today an article that we won't read through, but we can just show to say that there have been responses to these protests and pretty positive ones. But I wanted to just say, to your point, Garland, especially as we transition into talking about these protests in China, is that there is something very convenient about this. It reminds me of 2019 Hong Kong, when China was rising. A lot of the propaganda against it wasn't working. It was moving toward ending extreme poverty. Donald Trump administration, its trade war, all of that was massively backfiring at that time. And then suddenly Hong Kong was happening, and there were these so-called massive protests that were supposedly genuine. Then you find out that they're all NED backed, and that there was a real conspiracy to try to peel Hong Kong, as had been happening for many years in China, to try to peel Hong Kong from China, using democracy as the pretext. Now, China has had quite a successful period, not just the Taiwan elections, which is very good news for the One China principle, but it also had a lot of successful diplomatic exchanges at these big summits, the G20, the ASEAN summit. I mean, Xi Jinping humiliated Justin Trudeau, and I know, Margaret, you cover that, humiliated him. And it wasn't just that, though. It was a successful conversation with Joe Biden, literally looking like the adult in the room. Joe Biden talking about Uyghurs and all of this, and Xi Jinping is like, do what you say you do. If you say you're for the One China principle, you have to show us. Really looking like the world leader that China has become, and Asia, really, the whole continent in these summits, just really demonstrating how aligned they are with China. And then you also have, at the same time, the divided NATO, divided Europe. A lot of European countries, from Germany to France, saying, oh, China, we need to work with you. And then now you have disagreements about the Ukraine situation. So suddenly now everyone's talking about COVID in China again, right? Like, now there's these protests happening, and everyone's like, wow, these are so genuine. And look, it's, all the cold warriors in the media are like, look, this is all about, democracy. And even Naomi Klein, right? All these like, like State Department leftists, right? They're talking about how this is such a popular uprising. How great is it? Well, I just want to show you this thread by someone who's been doing some really good work on covering this, and then I definitely want your guys' reactions to close out. So here's just a brief thread by someone, Zhao Dashuai, and they talk about an overview, right? So here's a video. I won't play the sound to the video, but basically this is in Chengdu, and there's a small group of people chanting, "We want freedom," in Mandarin, and this is very important because China, even though there's a standard language, like a national language, there's a lot of dialects, not to mention a lot of other nationalities that speak other languages as well. But someone's chanting, "We want freedom in Mandarin," and then someone in Sichuan, which is the local dialect in this region, says "F your freedom." So basically, this person is saying that the vast majority of people want COVID policy to change. That yes, COVID policies have been stringent. There have been some excesses around testing. So, for example, and that there's a small minority of people using this as a stepping stone for regime change, and that people are working directly with foreign journalists, Western journalists, and their voices are being overrepresented. And so this person was on Telegram groups, and I don't want to hear about, oh, you can't get Telegram in China. The most people in China know how to use VPN. So this person was on Telegram and said, look at all of these people in this group organizing protests. Here you have Radio Free Asia, New York Times journalists, Epic Times journalists, which is Falun Gong, Right Wing Cult, CNN, Associated Press. You have them literally organizing a protest right outside of the Starbucks. Here's the time, here's the translation. That's what they were doing. And these journalists work with professional protesters to set the narrative. Once the narrative is set in your mind, everything you tend to follow, their train of thought. This is how, I think there's some translation issues, but basically they were listening to them talk on this Telegram group, these professional protesters, about what they were going to do. And so most active people in that group are not in China. One person described herself as an activist from overseas. And there's a clear divide between the reasonable majority and the tiny minority with ulterior motives. And so after this wasn't too long ago. This was as it was starting, November 27th. I'm just going to show one. It's like literally a 2-second thread. So let me just exit out of this. I want to show you what's been happening since then. Because this person who did a good job scouring Chinese social media and other things to show that the protests in China seem to be fizzling out faster than a wet firecracker. And here's Guangzhou, 5 protesters being scolded by locals as the police and onlookers enjoy the show. Here's what they said. We won't play it. Basically, they were saying that a local person says, "Are you even from Guangzhou? You're not here to help us. You're here to create trouble. We Cantonese are very generous. If you need money, we can give you some," implying that they are being paid by foreign forces. And then some of you may not know this, but Chinese people's tolerance for foreign-backed protests is very below zero. The century of humiliation is deeply entrenched. And then you have people giving the middle finger to these protesters. So obviously, this isn't some kind of panacea of freedom-loving people coming out. There's a lot that we have yet to know. There's a lot that we have to learn, but we should just be very suspicious when so many things are happening around the world, and China is playing this really interesting leadership role. And suddenly, as a lot of developments get hot, like with Taiwan, big change there, with these summits, suddenly now there's like a color revolution kind of thing happening in China around a policy, mind you, which, people are saying, oh, well, Danny, what about the COVID policy? Well, that's, first of all, China is China, and China will handle COVID and handle a lot better, mind you, than the United States has. But here you have today, the Global Times says epidemic control measures should be lifted in a timely manner to minimize inconvenience to the people, the National Health Commission says. Now, I read the article, and what it's saying is not that they're going to lift them fully, but that they're going to make sure that any excesses in the policy are taken care of, because there were some excesses in certain places. There were some people angry about what happened in Willamuchi and Xinjiang with the fire, that some people attributed delays because of testing and being able to address that situation. But I want to stop now and just kick it to you first, Garland, and then Margaret, your reactions to what's been going on, and anything you'd like to say about this development, which I know a lot of people have been following quite closely in the last few days.
A couple of things. Number one, the obvious, and that is, we're told that the Chinese people can't protest, that it's a totalitarian society. Oh, they're not allowed to protest. They'll all be machine gunned down and immediately run over by tanks. But now we're told, well, they're protesting all over the place. They're in the streets. They're doing whatever they want to, but they're not allowed to protest at the same time. That's number one. Number two, I remember watching protests in like Berlin and France, and they were like beating the hell out of the protesters and, abusing them, dragging them across the street. I mean, they really were being mercilessly beat. So I find it interesting that the same people who were in favor of lockdowns here were in favor of literally like if the unvaxxed should be put in prisons and, you know, dungeons and what have you, the people who were in favor, and this is not to say I'm for or against any COVID policy. I'm just saying these people were in favor of stringent COVID policies here. And they were in favor of suppressing anyone who wanted to protest against COVID policies here. And now they have completely done a 180 on China and saying, yay, they're fighting against COVID policies. And, you know, they should be able to protest all over the place. It's interesting to watch this 180, and, you know, you've got to laugh at it and say, you know, they're, you know, exposing themselves. But here's the other part of it. It kind of reminds me of the infamous Bay of Piglets in Venezuela, where a bunch of schmucks kind of tried to 60 idiots tried to come in and overthrow the country on like 18-foot Boston whalers, and literally they lost the war to fishermen. A bunch of fishermen took them out, and they thought they were going to take out the Venezuela army, and they lost a gunfight with fishermen. The pathetic attempts at regime change. We had Kazakhstan. We've got their fomenting a bunch of unrest in Iran. The world is hip to them. Everybody knows in every country, when they start seeing some protests kick up, they're like, uh-oh, they're at it again, guys. It's going to be a bit of an inconvenience. We're going to have to deal with it. But these morons from Washington, D.C. are starting the old color revolution thing. They think it's going to work. When was the last time it worked? It didn't even work in Syria. Now, they tore Syria up and killed a lot of people, but it didn't work. So the bottom line is, they don't even know. I mean, it's a good thing. They don't even know how to do regime change anymore. The only thing they know is, hey, let's start some protests somewhere and we'll get the people going and they'll all protest. What then? Oh, we haven't figured that part out. But let's get the protests going and we'll try to figure out. They have protests. So unfortunately, there's violence. Some people get killed. Whatever country it is, tampons quells the protest, and then they go on about their business. China, it's going to be an inconvenience. It's going to be a burr under their saddle for a couple weeks. The protests are going to go away, and then they're going to go on about their business. They're humoring the neocons for a couple weeks, but this is going nowhere. Let me add this. You know why? Because this is another example. At least the government in China somehow responds to the people. The people, we're unhappy with this. Okay, we'll do something. The government in Europe, the governments in the United States do nothing to respond to the people. If they get a little bit of response, that's a whole lot more than they get here.